In this series, I look at the most important philosophy books ever written, according to a survey done in the early 2000s. I present the work, something about the context and the author, try and pull out the highlights of the book, and determine why it's still important and why maybe read it today still. Today I'm looking at Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a French philosopher who lived from 1908 to 1961. He had a short but an excellent academic career in post-war France, starting teaching at a lycée, then moving on to the university, and finally as a teacher at the Collège de France. Merleau-Ponty was a contemporary of Jean-Paul Sartre, and together they largely established the tradition of phenomenology, existentialism, as well as Marxism in France. His first major work, published in 1942, is The Structure of Behavior, written much like Sartre's Being and Nothingness during the time of the Second World War. The structure mentioned in the title of the work refers to the way in which sensations are processed by one organism as a structure living in their particular environment. His major work, Phenomenology of Perception, would be published in 1945. And another important title of his hand is The Visible and the Invisible, which remained unfinished at the time of his death. The work that I present today is The World of Perception, which is actually a series of radio interventions that summarize very perfectly the essence of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy at that time. That is to say, in 7 sessions or 7 short chapters, Merleau-Ponty moves from the basis of perception and the restrictions on science through what space is, what objects are in that space, and how we perceive ourselves, others, or, for example, works of art. Merleau-Ponty's place in philosophy is best understood by seeing him as one of Edmund Husserl's most important students in France. He actually attended his 1929 Sorbonne lectures, and as such represents phenomenology in France. Phenomenology refers to the philosophical tradition that basically starts after Immanuel Kant's transcendental turn. Kant is the first to insist that philosophy should not focus on knowing the world or things in themselves, but rather philosophy should focus on our perception of those things, how they appear to us. And so Merleau-Ponty opens his lectures with the observation that the world is always my world. Any perception is always my perception. So it's a very empiricist starting point, but an empiricism not so much in the analytic sense where we strive for or think that we can obtain the objectivity of scientific observation, but rather that even science itself can only offer a partial perception of the world as we see it in a certain way. And philosophy, according to Husserl and the phenomenological tradition, should actually study the foundation of any perception at all, including scientific perceptions. Now, whereas Kant separated the thing in itself from the perceptions, Merleau-Ponty actually insists that the thing in itself is given along with the perceptions that we have of that thing. That the thing and our perceptions are in fact inseparable. This is the structure of perception. To clarify his point, he uses Descartes' own example of a piece of wax. Descartes famously observed that a piece of wax can change in so many fundamental ways in our perception but still remain the same thing. Merleau-Ponty, on the other hand, rather insists that it's impossible to separate, even talking about a piece of wax, from the perceptions that we have of that piece of wax as such. So our perceptions of color and texture and the sensations to the hands of a piece of wax coincide with that very thing that we're trying to describe. And with that, we get to the essence of Merleau-Ponty's philosophy. What Merleau-Ponty is trying to do is show how any and all perception is always bodily perception, is always my perception as a body in a world that I inhabit. So any meaning that we find in the world is actually given to that world in a pre-conscious way through our own perception of that world. It's actually impossible to separate the traits of things that we encounter from the perception we have through our body of those things. Merleau-Ponty uses the example of honey. When we think about honey, we don't just think about the substance or the thing. When we think about honey, or when we observe honey, it goes together with the color, with the texture, with the very taste itself. In a way, seeing honey is seeing its sweetness. So even talking abstractly about the color of honey, we're actually talking about a sweet color, a sensed color, a color that is full of its sensation to our bodily being. What commonly happens, though, is that we humans have a tendency to move beyond what is directly and bodily given through our sensations. As human beings, we are not satisfied with the given, but try and objectify and construct universal knowledge. Merleau-Ponty, in his book, elaborates on the example of art as a very typical example. When you look at the history of paintings, a large determinant factor has always been to most accurately represent things as they are in their objective reality. For example, one of the major improvements in the history of art has been the invention of perspective, giving objective depth to a painting, making it more real, so to speak. The way this simulation of objective reality in a painting is acquired is by taking a universal standpoint, by choosing an objective point from which perspective would be reconstructed independently from the perceiver. What Merleau-Ponty is trying to say becomes all the more clear when he uses the counterexample of Cézanne. Cézanne's way of painting a basket of fruit, for example, does not at all appear objective or universal. The perspective that we hope to find in art is absent. But rather this being an imperfection, Merleau-Ponty says, Cézanne actually succeeds in capturing our subjective perception of that basket of fruit. In Cézanne's paintings, we see how things appear to us as bodily perceiving subjects. That is, they appear to us not in an objective or universal perspective, but rather jumping out at us in a messy and unorganized way. Merleau-Ponty's analysis of the structure of our perception and the inseparability of our bodily being from those perceptions obviously has a number of important implications in other fields of philosophy. Most notably, a moral implication is that we have in fact no reason to consider that one mode of perception would be more valid than another. So for example, what he calls Western or indigenous modes of perception of the world are actually of equal value, just radically different. And in a similar way, the perception of a human being or the perception of the world of an animal are in fact two radically different ways of perceiving the world, and one is not more objectively true than the other. And the normative consequence is obviously that we are fundamentally responsible for our perceptions of the world and of others, and how we relate to those others. In general, phenomenology has proven to be a rich toolbox that can be used in many ways in contemporary philosophy. And Merleau-Ponty's philosophy in particular has proven to be one of the most compelling and most relevant applications of phenomenology up to today. It opens the door to applying phenomenology in a wide number of ways. Most notably, in the field of medicine and healthcare, we can see how Merleau-Ponty's insistence of the body can have an amazing impact on how we perceive care practice and how we work with bodies in sickness and in health. It's not a coincidence that Merleau-Ponty's most famous work, Phenomenology of Perception, is actually rich in examples of pathologies, of cerebral malfunctions that each in their own way reveal something about how we perceive and experience the world and our own bodily existence in that world. So whereas this short text, The World of Perception, is actually a good introduction and a shortcut to Merleau-Ponty's thought, it's easy to read and it goes right to the essence. For die-hard philosophers, Phenomenology of Perception is perhaps a much more rewarding work, which goes much more in-depth into all the dimensions concerned with a phenomenology that puts our bodily perception at the center of thought.